Okay, I think we are ready to go here. So welcome everyone. I'm Diana Alfuth. I'm the Horticulture Outreach Specialist for University of Wisconsin-Madison's Division of Extension. And I'm over in the western part of the state with mainly Pierce and St. Croix counties, but I serve the surrounding areas as well. And I'm happy to have everyone here tonight to talk about soils and soil testing and fertilizing, because this is a topic that I find there's a lot of confusion about. And so I think this is really a timely topic given this time of year. And I really want to thank the libraries for hosting this and making this possible, because it really allows us to reach out to a lot of different areas. The libraries that are helping host this are Augusta, Ellsworth, Clear Lake, and Amory. So again, thanks to them for making this happen. What we'll do here is go through and I'm going to talk about fertilizing and soil nutrients, taking a soil test, and then how to basically fertilize most of your yard and garden. And then there'll be time for questions at the end. So if you have questions that you want to put in the chat box, then someone will pass those along to me for answering near the end. So again, we are going to go ahead and get started as soon as I remember all my technology. All right, so one of the things that I want to emphasize to everyone is fertilizer is not technically plant food. And this is kind of one of my little pet peeves, because when you buy fertilizer, so often right on the package, it says plant food. And it's, we use that terminology all the time, feed your plants, meaning fertilize them, but that's technically not a plant's food. So a plant's food is the carbohydrates or sugars that are made during photosynthesis. So here's the little second grade diagram here on this slide, where we are basically talking about sunlight hitting the green leaves where there's chlorophyll. That is photosynthesis. It bounces around carbon dioxide and water, and it turns it into carbohydrates or sugars and gives off oxygen. And then the next step for that is kind of the opposite, and that's respiration. And that's when the plant breaks down those sugars to get the energy that it needs to grow. So just like us, we eat our foods, and that breakdown is what creates body heat and is what creates energy for us to run around and do our things and grow when we're smaller. And that's the same thing with plants, okay? So the food, the plant's actual food, comes from photosynthesis. And the reason I want to make sure that we mention that is that so often if a plant isn't growing well or isn't doing well, the instinct is to fertilize it. And that can be really detrimental. So we should never fertilize a stressed plant. And we should look at why that plant isn't growing well first. Chances are not that great that it needs fertilizer. In some cases, yes. But if it's not getting enough sunlight, if it's not getting enough light, and it's not doing enough photosynthesis, that may be why that plant looks weak or thin or lanky or not healthy and not growing much, because it's not getting the food. So we can't put a plant in a closet with all kinds of fertilizer. It's going to die because it doesn't get enough food, okay? But the plants also need fertilizer. So fertilizer, what you should think of that is more like our one-a-day vitamins. So we need food and we need energy, and some of our food has more calories for energy than other foods, but we also need the nutrients, the vitamins and minerals, and that's what fertilizer is. So there are 17 essential plant nutrients that all plants need in order to complete their life cycle. Okay, so there are all kinds of elements and such in the world, but plants all need carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, plus 14 soil elements. So the carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, they get out of the air. Okay, it goes in through the leaves. 14 of the nutrients that they need have to come from the soil. So that's what we're talking about with fertilizer. And these nutrients are broken into categories based on how much of each nutrient plants typically need. So the three big ones are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And these are the, I'm just going to make a little, so I can draw here. Where am I? Okay. So N, P, and K are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Those are primary or macronutrients. So the plants need those in the largest amounts. The second ones are, can't see my little cursor before I start drawing, so sorry for the sloppiness. The second ones are calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. Those plants need in a lesser amount than the first three, but more than in the last category, and that's the trace nutrients down here. So that's boron, chloride, nickel, copper, iron, manganese, molybdenum, and zinc. So with these nutrients, if any one of them is totally absent, that plant will not survive. Okay, so if you had absolutely no zinc in the soil, that plant's not going to be able to complete its life cycle. It's not going to be able to form cells. It's going to die. But it only needs them in tiny, tiny, tiny little amounts. Okay, so one of the greatest things is, I'm not sure where everyone here is listening from, but I'm assuming most of you are from Wisconsin and Western Wisconsin, and Wisconsin has super fertile soils. That's why we're such a big ag state. We have such a big agriculture industry because our soils are naturally very fertile. So if you lived in Utah or Nevada, you know that if you ever even travel through there, there's not a lot growing out there. They don't have big trees. They don't have big lush green fields and stuff. They have a lot of scrubby sagebrush and a lot of bare soil showing because their soils are not fertile. But here they are. So if you never put an ounce of fertilizer on anything, you would almost be guaranteed that you could still grow a plant. And look around us, you know, we have a lot of wild things, woods, fields, and everything, and plants are growing all over the place. Okay. So when we get into fertilizing, it's because we are trying to manage those plants and we want them to grow even better than they would if they were left all on their own. Okay. So if a plant isn't doing well, we really need to start doing a little detective work and figure out why. It may be that it's lacking in a nutrient, or it could benefit from more of that nutrient, but it may very well be something else as well. So soil, to define healthy soil, you can look at it in various ways. So healthy soil could have a good physical fertility, meaning it has a good texture. It's not hard pan like cement or beach sand, because beach sand can't hold much for nutrients or anything. If water stands there and that soil is not very well drained, that's poor physical fertility. It also has chemical fertility, which is the nutrient supply, the nutrients that I was just talking about. And it also has to have biological fertility. And what that means is it has to have all the little microorganisms in that soil, because that soil is alive. And here's just a little drawing for what soil looks like. So you might recognize some of these things that you've had in your soil, but a lot of what's down in the soil is microscopic. There's a lot of bacteria and fungi and other kinds of microbiota that's living in the soil. And these things are super, super important because they eat stuff, whether it's a plant root or a dead bug or a cocoon or something, and then they process it in their little bodies and then they poop it out. And that's what makes those nutrients available to the plants. Okay. So this stuff is going on all the time, and we need as many microorganisms down in that soil as possible. So the bigger things like the worms and the grubs, they eat bigger things and then they poop it out to one size, and then the littler things come along and eat that, and then they poop it out until it's down into the tiny little molecule that is needed in order for the plant root to take it up. So it's really, really important before we talk about fertilizing anything that we look at the other health of the soil. And that includes making sure that, like I said, there's good aeration in that soil and that it's a good habitat for these things. So I always tell gardeners or people that you're livestock farmers, okay? Everybody's a livestock farmer. And on this slide is showing your livestock. And the more you increase your livestock herd, the better your plants are going to be. So, and there are some of these things, some particular fungi, often called mycorrhizae, that actually form a symbiotic relationship with the plant's roots so that it gets its energy from the plants, but at the same time, it feeds the plants the nutrients, the nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, whatever that the plant needs. So there's a whole lot going on down in there. And we have to really pay attention to that, because if you have a really crummy soil that's really packed down hard and water doesn't infiltrate, or water is standing there and drowning the roots, then all the fertilizer in the world is not going to help your plants. So soil texture is a term that refers to the amount of sand, silt, or clay that's in the soil. So here's a little triangle, the little soil texture triangle. And basically, we can all kind of instinctively look at soil and say, it's sandy, or it's clayey, okay? And then loam is what we all want. And loam is basically where we kind of have some equal amounts of sand, silt, and clay in there, and that provides a good physical health for that soil. So texture, whether it's sand, silt, or clay, simply refers to the size of the particles. So soil is basically broken up rock. So at some point, all of our soil was a rock, and the weathering process over millions of years broke off little pieces of rock. And here we are, we have soil now. Bigger pieces that you can actually see are classified in the sand category. So you know that. You can look at a handful of soil, and if you can see individual grains, those are sand, simply based on their size. Silt is much smaller. If you have good eyesight, you can see the larger individual grains of silt, but some of the silt grains are small enough that they're technically microscopic. And clay is microscopic. So any little particle of clay, you need a microscope to see it, but what we see is a whole gazillion of them stuck together. And clay is, when it's wet, of course, it's more slimy and slippery, and that's just because those pieces are so super, super tiny. Whatever your soil texture is, it's really hard to change it, okay? You kind of have what you have. So unless you bring in a truckload of something else, you've got either sandy soil or silty soil or clayey soil. And this little triangle thing you can use, so you could take if you're curious about what you have, you can take a scoop of soil and go down about 6 inches and throw it into a mason jar and add some water and shake it all up and let it sit for a day or two. And you'll actually see layers form. And the sand will fall to the bottom, the silt will be in the middle, the clay will be at the top, and then there'll be organic matter floating way at the top. And you can kind of see, okay, well, 12% of this is sandiness and 40% of it is silty and 50% of it is clay or whatever. And you can use this triangle to classify what your soil is. And that's just a little helpful to know how to manage your soil texture in the future. Soil structure is the other term, and that refers to how those little particles, that sand, silt, and clay, is stuck together, okay? And it gets stuck together by organic matter and worm goo and other things. And what we want is for our soil to look kind of like this picture here, like cookie crumbs. Okay, so your graham cracker crust or your Oreo cookie crumbs that you make into your cheesecake or whatever, that's what we want our soil to look like. And you may not eat Oreo cookies the same ever again after I mention that, but we want some bigger chunks, we want some littler chunks, and we want to be able to look at it and say, oh yeah, air can go through that because roots need oxygen. So we want there to be little tunnels and channels for oxygen to go down through, as well as water. So that's what we want, is good soil structure. This we have total control over, and we can improve our soil structure by not rototilling a lot, because rototilling breaks up all those little pieces, and it would be like putting your Oreo cookie crumbs in the blender and blending it forever, and you end up with tiny little flour particles that stick together really well and compact really well. So avoiding rototilling, don't work with wet soil because that squishes the air pockets out and then you get clumpy, hard stuff. And adding organic matter, because organic matter, and what I mean by organic matter is anything that was once a plant, so compost, that's what feeds your livestock or your microbes that are in the soil. And it also helps to improve the soil structure. So we have control over the structure. We don't normally have control over the texture that we happen to have in our backyard. So the perfect garden soil is going to be 45% mineral, meaning sand, silt, and clay, 25% air pockets, 25% water, and that water will be stuff that's stuck to the organic stuff or the sand, silt, and clay particles, and then about 5% of it organic matter. And again, that's dead plant roots. It's compost that was added. If you went into a basic backyard that's never had anything done to it and you did a soil test, the organic matter is likely going to be about 1.5%. Okay, so what that shows you is if we're going to get up to this 5%, which is the ideal good silt loam garden soil, means that in most of our gardens, it would do us well to be adding organic matter. And that's why compost is always called gardener's gold and how you can never get enough of it, right? And we'll talk a little bit more about compost here in a bit, but this is what we're ideally shooting for. So what happens is, this is a little picture here of a root, okay? So this is the root and these are the cells and these are the, I guess I should change the color because it kind of blends in, but these are root hairs and these are really tiny. You can't really see them very much with your naked eye, but that's what goes out into the soil and grabs those fertilizer particles and pulls them into the plant and gets them up into the plant and transports them up to the leaves so the leaves can expand and grow and you can flower and all that sort of thing. So what you're seeing here, and I am just going to change my color to make this more visible. So what you're seeing down here is all of this blue stuff in here. That's basically water. Okay, that's called the soil solution. These little particles in here, these tan particles, those are pieces of soil. So that's a piece of sand, a piece of silt, a piece of clay, that sort of a thing. These little white spots that are in there, those are just little air pockets in the soil. And again, roots need oxygen in order to take up nutrients and water from the soil. And that's why if you overwater a plant and it's sitting in waterlogged soil and there's no air in there and it can't take up oxygen, it can't take up water either. So the roots need to be able to breathe. So we have all of this stuff going on basically down in the soil next to the plant. Now, also in there are the nutrients that we were talking about. So here up in the top right, this is the soil solution. That's basically water with all of these nutrients in there. And all of these little things that you see, like this K plus and Ca2 plus, and these are ions, often called cations or anions, depending on if it has a positive charge or a negative charge to it. This is what's floating around in the water, and this is what the roots need to take up. So they have this little electrical charge to them, and that's just a chemistry thing. And so they will stick to pieces of organic matter. They'll stick to pieces of soil. So like down here in the bottom left, you can see here's a clay particle, and there's these little pluses. Those are little things stuck to them. So those are some of these anions. And what has to happen is if the plant root comes through here, so here's the root here, okay, and it's out here and it's the plant saying, I'm hungry for some potassium, okay, then it has to have a potassium ion land on that root so that that root hair can suck it up and take it up into the plant, okay? So the root can't like go out and shop and grab it. It needs to have that potassium ion land onto that root, okay? Now, sometimes you look at these clay particles, for example, these have little ions, little plus charges and stuff stuck on those clay particles. Well, if that potassium ion is stuck on a clay particle, then it's not floating around in the soil solution. Well, then that root's not going to be able to get at it. So what all soils have is called a cation exchange capacity. So what's really happening in here all the time is there'll be things floating around in here and they'll bump into one of these things stuck on the clay particle and it'll push it off into the soil solution and then it'll stick there. And so stuff is happening all the time. And some soils have a bigger cation exchange capacity than others, meaning they can be moving things on and off more often. And that's important because the more often things are moving on and off, the more likely they're going to land on that root hair and be available if that plant is hungry for that particular nutrient. Now, what happens is some of these nutrients really compete with each other, okay? And if you get too many calcium ions floating around in here, they can get on those root hairs and prevent magnesium from landing on those root hairs. Okay, so with some of these nutrients, we have to be careful that we don't get an imbalance or an out of whack ratio. So if we put too much calcium on something, we could start having a magnesium deficiency in our plants because the calcium's getting in the way of the plant being able to access the magnesium. So the reason I mention this is because you really don't want to just go start adding all kinds of things to your soil willy-nilly because, quote, you heard it's good for it. And the biggest example that I have to mention is eggshells and calcium for tomatoes. So I see a lot of things on Facebook garden groups, and I hear all the time that people save their eggshells and then they grind them up and put them in the planting hole with their tomatoes or put them in where their tomatoes are going to be to prevent blossom end rot, which is caused by calcium not getting to the developing tomato plants or tomato fruits, okay? And while it's true that that's what causes blossom end rot, you live in Wisconsin, you probably have more than enough calcium in your soil already. So I really get nervous when people are adding all these eggshells because now you could be boosting that calcium content of your soil way up high, and now you're going to have a magnesium deficiency. So then it's the same with Epsom salts. So we hear a lot of advice, add a cup of Epsom salts with your tomatoes. Not in Wisconsin, okay? So this is something that is useful, like out on the West Coast where the soils are low in magnesium, but we're not low in magnesium in most cases. And if you've ever added compost, you've added more than enough magnesium. And if you add too much magnesium in the form of Epsom salts, then you're going to have a potassium deficiency because magnesium outcompetes potassium. So my bottom line is that you should know what you're trying to do and that you have a deficiency before you go adding any one thing. And again, we'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. But this is what's going on down in the soil as far as the plants are concerned with fertilizer. So, oh, I guess I talked ahead of myself a little bit, but again, the cation exchange capacity, that indicates how readily those cations or anions, those little molecules or atoms are able to be released into the soil solution and then be available to the plants. So this is another reason why we'll talk about sending in a soil sample here. If you send a soil sample into a lab, they will test your cation exchange capacity, and that will make a difference on how much of what you should add. And if you just do like a little over-the-counter test tube soil test, that doesn't test your cation exchange capacity, and it never gives you the recommendations for what to add. So my point is that if I'm low on potassium and you're low on potassium, the amount that we would need to add might be different based on our particular soil's composition and cation exchange capacity. And this brings us to pH. Okay, so pH is a very important thing of soils. And typically when I ask people, well, what does pH mean? I get answers of, well, how acid or basic or alkaline your soil is. But it's like, well, what does that actually mean? And what it actually means is pH measures the number of hydrogen ions in the soil. So why is that important? Because I told you that plants can get hydrogen out of the air. They don't take it up in the soil. However, if there are hydrogen ions bouncing around in the soil, and if there's a lot of them versus a little of them, they can be getting in the way of or affecting the availability of other plant nutrients. Okay, so that's why it's so super important to know what your pH is and to have your pH in the right range for whatever you're wanting to grow. So there are some plants like blueberries that really like to grow in a lower pH soil. They evolved that way. But if you try to grow a plant that wants a low pH, if you try to grow blueberries in a pH that's up around 7, they won't survive. And what they'll do is they'll slowly die off because they aren't able to take the nutrients out of the soil that they need to grow and do their life cycle. So it does not matter if you pour a whole bunch more fertilizer on, it's not going to matter. If you don't change the pH to where it needs to be, that fertilizer is just going to sit there in the soil. So that's why it's so super, super important that you test pH. And here's a little chart of pH, and you can see that neutral is basically around 7, okay, just under 7 is where we mostly want things. And if you look down this chart at that rate, almost everything has a nice wide line, and ammonium's not important. So all of those nutrients are readily available, okay? If your pH gets high, let's say it's up around 7.5, look at how iron becomes less available, okay? And if your pH is really low, down around 5.5, look how phosphorus becomes less available. So oftentimes we see, so I live down near Elmwood, Wisconsin, and if you've ever been through here, it is down at the bottom of the coulees, and the Ogallie River runs through it. And downtown where the Ogallie River is, there are some big white pine trees, and their needles are yellowish. They're just, the trees are there, they're alive, they're big, but the needles are always yellow. And the reason is because they have an iron deficiency. Iron deficiency shows up as yellowing foliage or needles. But right around Elmwood and Spring Valley, they used to mine iron ore. I can dig in my backyard and find chunks of irony rock and stuff. There's plenty of iron in the soil. However, these trees are down along the Ogallie River, and all of the big bluffs are actually limestone. So over the years, a lot of limestone has gone down when the riverbanks, overflow during heavy rains or spring thaw. That limestone is on the shoreline. So the pH right in that area is high. And so with that high pH in those areas, the iron is not available. There's plenty of iron in that soil. If we were to test that soil and test it for iron, there would be plenty in there, but it's not making its way into the tree because of that pH. So that is a really important thing that we need to keep in mind, and why pH is so important. I strongly, strongly recommend that you do not get an over-the-counter pH tester or the little electrode things, because I found them to be inconsistently reliable. And it's just way, way better if you send in a soil test, have them test the pH, you know exactly what it is. And the other thing is that little probe doesn't tell you what to do about it, okay? The soil lab would tell you exactly how much lime to add to get your pH up, or how much sulfur to add to get your pH down, based on your soil type, texture, and cation exchange capacity. Okay, so this is why pH is important and shouldn't be ignored. Again, fertilizing isn't going to work if your pH is out of whack. So how do you do a soil test? So this is just a little picture here of the university soil lab. There are different soil labs around. So the University of Wisconsin has one. It's currently located in Marshfield. University of Minnesota has one. And then there are private labs as well that are just fine. They'll do testing for homeowners. Before you use them, just kind of check them out and see what you're getting for it, okay? So currently a soil test is $15. If you just Google UW Wisconsin Soil Lab, the first thing that comes up is the lab. It's again located in Marshfield. And then you can just click on samples and everything is there. But I'm just going to walk through what you would do to take a soil test. These soil tests, we recommend that you do them every 4 to 5 years, because if you're adjusting something or adding things to your soil, the pH could change, or the amount of phosphorus and potassium could change. Remember that if your pH is high or low, and you adjust it by adding lime or sulfur, it's going to trend back to where you started, because it's based on the parent material. Okay, so you're always going to trend back to where you want it. So that's why every 4 to 5 years you want to test again. So the soil test, the basic soil test, will tell you the pH. It'll tell you how much phosphorus and potassium is in your soil. It does not test for all those micronutrients, because, or the trace nutrients, because we don't have any reason to believe that they're not adequate, okay? Because plants need them in such tiny amounts. Now, if you suspected for some reason that you have a deficiency of, say, calcium or iron or something like that, you can add that onto your testing. It's just going to cost you like another $5. The basic test at the university lab is $15. And again, once every 5 years. But if you wanted to test for all those other things, you can. It's just like that each one is like $5 more. This test will also tell you the amount of organic matter in there. But even more important is you're going to put on there what you want to grow, like vegetables, blueberries, lawn, flowers, and they will tell you exactly how much of what to add to your soil in order to be successful growing what it is you're choosing to grow. Okay, so when you take a soil sample, and again, the instructions for doing it are right there on that website, but let's say you're doing your vegetable garden, okay? First off, if you have any reason to believe the soil at one part of your garden is different than the other part, or if it's your lawn, you know, that one part is different than the other, maybe your soil in your front yard seems sandier than the soil in your backyard. If you think there's any difference in the soil, or if you've managed that soil differently in the past, meaning you've put a lot of compost on one garden bed or a bunch of mulch on one garden bed and not on another, then do 2 separate tests, because your results will be different for those 2 areas. But otherwise, let's say this is your vegetable garden or maybe your back lawn, whatever. And so we live in Wisconsin, right? So this is a W, okay? If you live in Minnesota, you flip this over. But what you would do is, what you want is an average of the soil in that area. So you would go to the top and of the W up here where there's a shovel. You're going to take your bucket along with you, and everywhere there's a shovel, so every point of the W here, you're going to take a scoop of soil. So kind of peel back the sod if there's grass there. If it's in your vegetable garden, you don't have to worry about that. But dig down about the depth of your spade. So that's going to be about 6-7 inches. And then kind of remove that scoop of soil and then kind of slice down the backside of that hole so that you're getting that soil profile. So you're getting some from the top 6 inches of your soil. Okay. And you throw that scoop in the bucket, and you do it every place where there's a shovel on this W. You throw it all in the bucket, you mix it all together, and then out of there, you're going to take your sample that you send in. And it's typically about a cup of soil. Now, in our extension offices, we have the forms and everything, and these little soil bags that have Bucky Badger's picture on it. Okay, that's what's over here on the side that of this slide. But you don't need that official bag. Okay, and right now our offices aren't open. If you want this, we can mail it to you. Just call whatever county you're in, the extension office, and ask them to send this to you, and we certainly can. But you don't need that. You can just use a Ziploc bag. Okay, the form that you use to submit it, this is where you would put your name and address and stuff. You would, if you were sending in multiple samples, so like on this sheet here, there's like room for like 6 of them. You just want to make sure that you label them all, you know, front flower bed, back flower bed, vegetable garden, so that you make sure that you line up the results with the proper area. These little things down here talk about what you want to grow there. So you'll indicate, like I said, if you want to grow blueberries or vegetables, that sort of a thing. And then, like I said, you do not need this official bag, but you can put your soil in a Ziploc bag and you mail it into the lab in Marshfield. And they will put it into their system, they'll do their test, and then they will get you the results, typically by email. If you have email access, they'll send you an email with a little code. You just click on a link they give you, put in your code, and boom, there are your results. It takes about 10 days, give or take a little, depending on how busy they are. I was telling people last week they could go and get soil right now as long as it wasn't muddy and sloppy, because you don't want to, you know, put a sloppy glop of mud in a bag to send it off. But now we have snow again, so we're going to have to wait a little bit for it to dry out enough again to take soil samples. But so that's how you take a sample and you send it in. So then you'll get the results back, and they'll look something like this. And so this is the overall picture, and I know that's hard to see. And so in the next slide, this is the top of it, okay? So I just want to show you what you get on your results, okay? And again, whenever you get the soil sample results, whether it's from the UW lab or a private lab or whatever, if you have any questions with interpreting them, that's what I'm here for, and Extension is here for, so you can always contact us about it. So this is one that somebody sent me. They took this sample last August. It was their mixed bed perennial flowers and shrubs that they were growing. And here are the results. So according to the soil lab and their recommendations, no soil pH adjustment is recommended. So the pH for them for growing mixed bed perennial flowers and shrubs is just fine. But here is what they say to add. So they say to add 0.15, and what this is pounds of nitrogen per 100 square feet. So you have to do a little math, you have to do a little measuring to know how big your area is, whether it's your vegetable garden or whatever. And then you know that this recommendation is 0.15 pounds of nitrogen per 100 square feet, 0 phosphate or potassium, or phosphorus, and 0.8 pounds of potassium. Now, I'll get into this a little bit more when I show you the bottom half of the soil test report, okay? But over here also on the side is a little bit more of a description for what they mean, okay? So apply about 0.6 pounds high nitrogen fertilizer per 100 square feet, apply in 2 or more applications within 4 to 6 weeks where shrubs are planted, increase by 50% in years where organic mulch is applied. So these are some pretty specific instructions on what you should do for that area, okay? It says that no phosphate fertilizer is needed, so no phosphorus. This is not detrimental to plant growth, but may contribute to surface water problems, and I'll talk about that more in a minute. So phosphorus is an environmental pollutant. It's what causes our lakes and rivers and streams to turn into pea soup green in summer, so we do want to avoid that. And then there's the potassium, and it's telling this person to apply it annually for 2 years. So in other words, they got to get these levels back up to where they need to be. And so there are the specific instructions. And again, this is what you get from a lab that you don't get from the over-the-counter thing, which is going to likely cost you at least $15. So here's the bottom half of that results thing. And there's a little bit of just basic stuff here on environmental tips and whatever, but this is the laboratory analysis interpretation. So this is what they actually found in this soil sample. So the pH is listed down here at 6.8. It's also this blue line here that shows that it's at 6.8, okay? And that's a okay place, okay? It's not high, it's kind of near sufficient here. And so that's why they said that there's no adjustment needed for pH. Phosphorus, it shows here, this orange line is off the chart. Okay, now this is not uncommon because there's a lot of phosphorus in organic matter, mulch, dead plants, and phosphorus is very immobile in the soil, meaning it doesn't wash away. And so we very often get a buildup of phosphorus, but you'll remember when I showed you the first half of this, that it said phosphorus is excess phosphorus is not detrimental, but it's an environmental pollutant. But what this tells you is, don't be buying phosphorus fertilizer and putting it on because you don't need it. So why spend money on it? And then the potassium, the green line, is low. So that was why there is a recommendation for putting some potassium fertilizer on there. And then down here at the bottom right, you'll see the organic matter was low. 1.4. Remember I said that the ideal soil has 5% organic matter. So if this is already a mixed bed where things are already planted in it, it's going to be a little challenging to get organic matter down in there. But if you're starting something new, this is the time to work in compost and organic matter. All right, so the main nutrients that I want to talk about are the biggies, okay? So nitrogen, the test does not test for nitrogen, and that's because nitrogen is very mobile in the soil, meaning if you took your soil test and then you get a 2-inch rainstorm and you tested the soil again, the nitrogen level would be lower because it does wash out of the soil. So we don't even bother to test for it. And because it's the most limiting nutrient, we know that all plants will do better with a little extra nitrogen. Okay, now that doesn't mean that all of our wild woods and fields and stuff, they're only getting the nitrogen that they get out of the oxygen and from decomposing plants that die around them and stuff, and they're growing just fine. But if we want them to grow even better and bigger and bushier and produce even more fruits for us, we need to add a little extra nitrogen. But we don't want to overdo it either, because then it just washes out and becomes an environmental pollutant. It gets into our wells and groundwater in the form of nitrates, and you can burn plants. You can also cause plants to grow a whole lot of leaves and never any fruits. So if you're trying to grow tomatoes and you over fertilize, you're going to have big bushy plants and very little spaghetti sauce. Okay. But if you have yellowing foliage like this, where it's all over yellow, or if you have plants that just don't look as dark green as they should be, nitrogen might be what they need. Phosphorus, I already mentioned, it's very important, and it's mobile in the plant, meaning if you have a plant that's, if the soil doesn't have enough phosphorus in it, the plant will steal the phosphorus out of old leaves to use it to grow the new leaves. And then you might get purplish on your older leaves, okay? So, so this is just a symptom that you would show up for. Again, most of the time, 90% of the people who send in a soil test, they have excessive phosphorus, because if you've ever put phosphorus fertilizer on or any kind of manure or compost, you've added a lot of phosphorus and it does not go anywhere. Okay. Potassium is the last of the three biggies. And this one is kind of in between nitrogen and phosphorus, meaning that it's somewhat mobile in the soil. It does kind of disappear beyond just what plants take up, but not as much as nitrogen, and it doesn't hang around as phosphorus. So it's very often excessive on soil tests as well. Again, especially if you've recently added compost or manure or something like that. But it also is one that can get low. So that's why we want to test every 4 to 5 years, because in that amount of time, your potassium levels could change to where you need it. Calcium, I mentioned this one, and I just really want to mention this because this is a picture of blossom end rot. And calcium is immobile in the plants, and it is taken up out of the soil and gets up to these developing tomato fruits through the water that goes up through the stem, through the vascular system. And anything that interferes with that water flow to these developing fruits will result in no calcium getting there. So this is, again, going back to putting the eggshells in calcium Tums and calcium tablets and milk. And there are all kinds of recommendations that are out there to get calcium in there. But most of the time, it's something getting in the way of the calcium getting up to these developing fruits. Usually it's uneven watering, or it's cool temperatures. So if you get your tomatoes out there too fast, and we have cool night temperatures or cool soil temperatures, that makes an impact on if the calcium can get up there. So just because you have a nutrient deficiency does not necessarily mean you have a soil nutrient deficiency. And if you have a symptom like this, it's a good idea to test the soil first to make sure it's there, or else look at why is it not getting taken up and up to where it needs to be. Okay. Magnesium, again, is the other one. Again, rarely deficient. And if you start goofing up your magnesium and calcium ratios, you're going to start goofing things up. Okay. So, so do not, there is no silver bullet in fertilizing. And again, just because it's a household thing. So I get questions all the time. Should I put coffee grounds in when I plant my tomato? Should I put eggshells in? Should I put Epsom salts in? Should I put banana peels? There's one thing flying around the internet right now of some guy blending up banana peels in a blender to water his plants and stuff as a source of potassium. Yeah, it's a source of potassium. And if you're low on potassium, it might help, but there's nothing magical about a banana peel. And there are gazillions of other sources of potassium, including basic compost or any other fertilizer that has it. Okay, so these are the symptoms of magnesium, where you have green veins or magnesium deficiency, green veins and yellowing outer edges. That's also the symptom of iron deficiency. So again, before we just start dumping magnesium on, let's look at the soil. Let's look at the pH, because again, it could be that the pH is off, and that's why these nutrients aren't getting up into the leaves. Sulfur is the other one, and that's the reason I mentioned this is because sulfur is in Epsom salts, because Epsom salts is magnesium and sulfur. And if you start using stuff like that, usually Epsom salts does not affect your pH because it's considered a neutral acid, but sulfur is in some different fertilizers. And these symptoms that you see look very similar to a nitrogen deficiency. And that's why it's really important to, if you're seeing some kind of deficiency, if I saw a plant like this, I'd say give it some nitrogen. If it doesn't perk up and green up, well, then we got to look further. Okay. You can also do tissue tests. So let's say your soil says you have plenty of all of these nutrients. You can actually send in leaves and they can test those and see if there are enough of each of these 17 essential nutrients in that leaf. And if there aren't, well, then you know there's some kind of a disconnect between the soil and the actual tissue that's not getting it, that's causing those nutrients to not get up there. Okay. Most of the time it's greenhouses that are doing tissue tests because they have a whole lot more issues than a home gardener who's actually growing in actual soil. So soil nutrients are, again, every plant had to have taken up every single one of those 17 essential nutrients in order to grow. So if that plant grew and you now dug it up, ate it, whatever, and you throw that on your compost pile or in the soil, as those plants decompose, they release every single one of those 17 nutrients, right? Because there was some of that in every cell of those plants. If there wasn't, that plant would not have been able to grow. And because these trace nutrients and these lesser nutrients like calcium and sulfur and potassium and magnesium, because plants need them in such tiny amounts, if you've added compost, you've added enough of these things. That's why most of the time when you buy fertilizer, these things aren't even in there, okay? Chemical versus organic. Do we care? The plants don't care, okay? Because the ion all has to get down to that little K plus or that little calcium anion or cation in order for the plant to suck it up in the root. So that doesn't matter, but organic fertilizers tend to be nicer to all those microbes that are living in your soil. They also tend to be slower release. And because there's a lot of organic matter in that horse poop up there or any other organic fertilizer, usually that's helping to improve your soil structure and stuff. So from that standpoint, organic fertilizers might be better. But if you have a nitrogen deficiency and you need a quick nitrogen shot, the plant doesn't care where it comes from. Okay. On fertilizer bags, again, here's my pet peeve because these bags say rose food and lawn and garden food, okay? But it's not really food, it's vitamins. So the numbers, there's always going to be 3 numbers. The first number is the percent of nitrogen in that bag. The second number is the percent of phosphorus, and the third number is potassium, and it's alphabetical. So if you ever forget which is which. And what do you buy? Well, whichever one's the best deal, whichever one has the highest concentration of that nutrient in it. Organic fertilizers, it's hard to say exactly what they have in it because they're hard to analyze. Horse manure or cow manure, part of it depends on how old it is, how long it's been sitting, how long it's been rained on, those sorts of things. So this is just a little chart to show you. Typically, with the exception of blood meal, organic fertilizers are much lower in nitrogen than synthetic fertilizers, but they also tend to be plenty high in phosphorus. Fertilizer pretty much is fertilizer. So don't sit there and worry too much about the brand. A lot of it is marketing. You can see here, this is a rose fertilizer with 6-12-6 for your analysis. That would work just fine on vegetables if that's what you need. If you need that kind of an analysis based on your soil test result, don't worry about what it's called. That's all marketing. In most vegetable gardens, if you do your soil test, you're going to be off because if you've added compost and stuff in the past, you'll be off the charts in phosphorus, off the charts in potassium. The only thing you really need is nitrogen. I recommend lawn fertilizer because lawn fertilizer is usually the cheapest, highest concentration of nitrogen without phosphorus and potassium in it. Okay. Sometimes something will say with added iron for quick green up, only going to work if you're low on iron. okay? And there are parts of the country where some of these things are useful because their soils are naturally, inherently deficient in things. But in Wisconsin, it's rare. Okay, so as far as the fertilizer amounts, you can follow the package instructions, but really, hopefully you've got a soil test and it's going to tell you, remember I showed you on those results, it said add 0.15 pounds of nitrogen per 100 square feet. You have to do some math in order to figure out how much to add. So you'll see that this is a 40-pound bag and 13% of that is nitrogen. Okay, so you just got to do some math to figure out how many actual pounds of nitrogen are in this bag, and then how many 100 square feet that will cover based on your soil test. And again, if you ever have any issues with doing calculations like this, let me know. I'm happy to help. So just a couple of quick things on fertilizing the various things that we fertilize. Okay, lawns are, if you want a super high quality, nice lawn, you should plan on fertilizing 3 times a year. On the holidays, a lot of times people get out there as soon as things start greening up and put fertilizer on, and that's too early. The grass is already programmed to grow. There's nitrogen and stuff that came out of the atmosphere and the snow over winter, and it's not until Memorial Day that those levels go down and it's due for another shot of nitrogen. So Memorial Day, 4th of July, if it's growing good and we've had a lot of rain or you're watering, and then Columbus Day. If you want a nice lawn, or if you have sandy soils, but it doesn't have to be super, super lush, then you can fertilize twice a year, Memorial Day and Labor Day. That Labor Day one is the most important one. So if you just want your lawn to be green, and, you know, somewhat healthy, then 1 time a year on Labor Day is enough. But fertilizing is important. If you don't fertilize at all, then your grass will get weak and then weeds take over, and it's actually better for the environment for you to fertilize once or even twice a year and keep your lawn healthy so that it holds onto water and runoff and infiltrates things and stuff, more than just becoming kind of dandelion patch where things run off more. Okay, never fertilize a drought-stressed lawn. So if it's July and we haven't had rain and your lawn is brown, do not fertilize. Okay, and also remember that in Wisconsin and pretty much most everywhere, it is illegal to put phosphorus fertilizer on a lawn unless you have a soil test that says your soil is low in it, or if you're starting a new lawn from seed or sod. And that again is because there's usually plenty of phosphorus in the soil, and it is an environmental pollutant, and they're trying to keep that out of the surface water. Don't remove your clippings as you mow your lawn. Those clippings release these nutrients back on, and they basically are kind of like one whole fertilization for the year. Okay, if you have shady lawns, you need to fertilize less because your grass just won't grow as much. It won't use as much. And if you have an established lawn that you've been fertilizing every year, twice a year for 10 to 15 years, you probably can back off because there's a lot of nutrients in that soil. And don't do weed and feed products. Okay, weeding and feeding need to be done at different times of the year. And I know it's hard to find crabgrass preventer without fertilizer in it, but if you have crabgrass, that means your lawn's not healthy enough. You need to raise your mower deck, and you need to talk to me so we can get your lawn healthier and thicker, and then you shouldn't have crabgrass. Okay. Trees and shrubs, the general rule for any perennial plant, a tree, a shrub, flowers, is that you do not ever fertilize after July 15th, because by then we want things to stop growing and to harden off for winter. So all of these perennial plants, and annual plants as well, actually, but they need the fertilizer there readily available when they're putting on a lot of growth. So that means in spring, when things start shooting up, that's the main time that they need fertilizer, and they need those nutrients there. They don't need it in fall. They should be shutting down for the year. If it's a newly planted tree or shrub, it's best to plant it in the native soil, and wait a year before you fertilize it. And then fertilize it ideally in accordance with a soil test, but otherwise with a balanced like 10-10-10 fertilizer. The reason we don't want to fertilize them right away on planting is because then they put on a lot of top growth. And we don't want them to do that. We want them to grow roots that first year. A mature established tree or shrub rarely needs fertilizer unless you have symptoms or a soil test that says that something's really low on something, or maybe if you're on a super sandy soil. Mature trees have such big root system, they can find all the nutrients that they need. Tree spikes are not great because they only dissolve in that little area, like a foot around where that spike is, and there's roots all over the place. And they continue to dissolve even into fall, when I just said we don't want to be fertilizing things, okay? Again, most established perennial flowers do not need fertilization. If they have an off color, if they're not deep green, if they're not looking lush, well then maybe, okay? Mulches add organic matter and they add a lot of phosphorus and potassium, but they don't add nitrogen. So if you put down some fresh mulch like wood chips or something like that, it's a good idea to also put down a little boost of nitrogen to counteract that in the mulch. And again, early spring, just as growth begins, is the most important. Maybe again in late June if you're really low in nutrients and they need a boost, but don't do it after July 15th again, because those plants need to start thinking about winter. Those plants will know that the days are getting shorter and stop growing. And then vegetables, again, soil test is going to tell you what you have or what you need. If you've ever added compost and organic matter, which the recommendations are that you add 2 inches a year, put it on the top of your soil, work it in a little bit, plant your garden, you will have everything in there you need, okay? Except some extra nitrogen. So adding some fertilizer after you plant, side dressing with some nitrogen is good. Most everything is going to make it through the year just fine with just that. And as I said, you don't want to overdo nitrogen or you get lots of leaves and not many vegetables. Things like beans and peas that are legumes, they take nitrogen out of the air, so they don't need any soil nitrogen fertilizer. Onions are a big feeder, so giving them more nitrogen 6 to 8 weeks after you plant, that can help them get bigger and fuller. But most everything else doesn't need fertilizer throughout the year. And annual flowers, they do kind of use a lot of nitrogen because it takes a lot of nutrients to grow all those big, bright, showy flowers, okay? So again, make sure that you fertilize them if they're in the ground when you plant them, and again, late June. And that's probably going to be enough. If you overdo it, you're going to get flopping, big, tall, lanky flowers. If you have worked organic matter into the soil before you planted those annuals, you'll probably be fine with the other things. So again, all you're looking for is some nitrogen. Be careful about liquid fertilizers and overdoing it because it can burn roots. And again, it can provide too much nitrogen. A lot of those liquid fertilizers like Miracle-Gro and stuff are really high in nitrogen. If you're growing in containers, usually you're not using actual soil, you're using a potting mix. And so nutrients don't hold on to that as well. So you're not going to do a soil test for these things. You're just going to assume that you need to fertilize every 6 weeks or use a slow release fertilizer in there and just follow the package instructions. And basically we're looking at something balanced, 10-10-10. The soil, the potting mix that's in there, whether it's a potting soil, composted wood chips, peat, that sort of thing, it's going to have all those other trace nutrients in it. So you shouldn't have a problem with those not being there. Like I said, a slow release fertilizer that is kind of like a granular, like BBs that you put on there. And every time you water, it releases a little bit. Those can last for anywhere from 6 weeks to 3 months, depending on the brand. And that makes it easy. You don't have to worry about it. And then houseplants, you should treat as a container. Again, we don't use soil in the pots. We use potting mix. So it is a good idea to repot them every few years because that potting mix can break down, and then you're going to get a new boost of those nutrients in there. If you have something like this in this picture where there's this white stuff showing up on the sides of the pots or on the surface of the soil, that means you're adding too much nitrogen and you're getting what's called soluble salts build up in there, and that can burn the roots. So if you're seeing that going on, back off on fertilizing. You can flush it out by pouring a lot of water through and letting it run out. But it's probably a good idea to repot them, and do not fertilize houseplants between September and February because the days are short. The light in your house is low. They're not growing then, and they shouldn't be growing then because they don't have good light. But now is the time of year that they're waking up. So now's the time to fertilize your house plants. And that is it. So I know we are up on time here, but I am going to see if we have any questions, and I should leave that up there, I think. So our moderators here, are there any questions that have come in on the YouTube thing? Because I'm not able to see that. So if you have any questions, go ahead and type them into the chat box on the YouTube, and we'll get to them. Otherwise, as I said, here's my contact information. And no matter where you live, whether it's in one of my counties or not, you're more than welcome to send me questions at any time, or to go to your own county's extension office to see if someone can help you there, and they'll get you to the right place. No. So again, fertilizing, I know, can be confusing, and I get a lot of questions about, how to fertilize, how much, when, and my biggest advice is don't make it too confusing. It's not as complicated as it sometimes seems. So start with a soil test, and don't try to micromanage your soil too much. At least not here in Wisconsin. All right, so not seeing any major questions coming in here. So again, contact me if you have any questions. Thanks again to the libraries in Augusta and Ellsworth and Clear Lake and Amory for hosting this. Next week, we'll be doing another one, and we'll be talking about alternative gardening spaces. So how you could use straw bale gardening or pallet gardening or lasagna gardening to grow things. And so I